tukameka pakwingira mubusuma waemba tukameka pakwingira mubusuma waemba tukameka pakwingira mubusuma waemba.
So welcome to another Rising Tide Foundation dialogue, where we have the pleasure, Cynthia Chung and myself, of talking to different experts, analysts, historians, and others from around the field, leaders, thought leaders in culture, in geopolitics, in history, and science. And today we have the great pleasure of having Lawrence Freeman, a longtime senior analyst, an expert on all things Africa, who I had the pleasure of discovering many years ago. Larry has written hundreds and hundreds of articles dealing with economic analysis, histories of neo-colonialism, and many, many, many more things with always a solution orientation for Africa. And from myself and my personal experience, I know it was always very difficult growing up, as you know, watching things like World Vision and seeing pictures of starving children across Africa and being told the best you can do is give $1 a day. And as a young kid, you know, you want to have answers. And I would always go to adults, teachers, family members, and ask them, well, why is it that my life, I don't have to suffer from these things? We have electricity, we have running water, we have security, but yet there's these millions of children around the world I'm being shown pictures of who suffer from a lack of those things that I take for granted. Why? Why can't we do anything? And not surprisingly, you'd never really get a very good answer. More often than not, we were told, you know, it's just the way that the world is. So it was a real breath of fresh air, discovering that there were solutions, that there was a fight, and that there are practical remedial actions that can be taken. Larry has made his life and devoted his life towards the cause of humanity, and specifically with a focus on Africa. He maintains the Africa and the World website. It's an incredible resource site for anybody who's looking for real solution concepts for Africa. He has been the vice chair, recently appointed to the Lake Chad Basin Scientific Committee. He's, again, a researcher and author. He has also had experience working on the advisory committee of AFRICOM under General Kip Ward. And he's led teams of state senators to Sudan and other places where different ICC, International Criminal Court, charges against the Sudanese government of slavery and other forms of abuses were disproven by actually bringing people to the ground and showcasing that there was no evidence to back up these claims that were much more tied to a desire for regime change than anything else. So these were all just some of the things that Lawrence has done in recent years. And I think with that, before we begin our questions, Lawrence, how about you say a few other things about what put you on this path that you find yourself now?
I mean, the long story is it evolved out of a political social conscience that I developed when I was in high school and into college. So that's a long time ago. And Africa was actually on my mind at that point when I was 16, 17, 18. And I didn't really do much about it, but I actually had the same questions that you just went through. Why is this happening? Why are people starving? With all the technology we have in farming, it doesn't make any sense. But I drifted off into other political activity for many, many years. And then again, in the late 1980s, I began to think about Africa again and started to write about it. Some Cameroonians started to look at my material and invite me to speak at their conferences. And the work with the Cameroonians sort of led me into Nigerians who were going through a very difficult process. 1993, their election was annulled by General Sani Abacha, the military leader of the country in Nigeria. And some people thought that they were going to re-experience a Biafra crisis, which was 1967 to 1970, and very ugly, brutal war. Over 1 million people died in a move to separate Biafra from the rest of Nigeria. They thought this was going to be repeated. So from afar, they were looking at my work and my ideas, and sight unseen, that they had someone in the United States who was watching me. They invited me over to my first trip. Was about June 1994. And that started me on the road to now going from writing about Africa, which I've been doing from about 1989 on, to actually knowing more about Africa, studying the country. I made many, many repeated trips to Nigeria, met with all the top officials, including the leader of the country. At the same time, I was involved with the Schiller Institute, and we were looking at Sudan and some of the things that were going on there that led to many trips to Sudan. Branched out into Ethiopia because I happened to realize that their economy and their thought process on economics was superior to the rest of the continent. So I involved myself in analyzing their economy and then traveling there. Made one trip to Mali after the terrorists overthrew the country and looked at potential agricultural development. And then I was invited, I met the executive secretary of the Lake Chad Basin Commission, a very thoughtful person, Sanusi Abdullahi, an engineer. And he was saying, I spoke up at a conference he was in Washington on Transaqua. He said, well, we met afterwards and we met the next day. He said, well, I want this Transaqua program for the Lake Chad Basin. He was the head of the commission, the executive secretary. So he invited me out there with my wife in November. I don't think he thought I was going to come, but we did. And we had a 3-day meeting, and I was made the vice chairman of the International Scientific Advisory Committee. And then him and I just worked very hard. We met with numerous Nigerians in government. We circulated these ideas. The Chinese began to look at this project for water transfer. And we built up enough steam to have a conference in 2018 called the International Conference to Save Lake Chad. And I was a featured speaker at the conference. I also was able to address the heads of state from the Lake Chad Basin countries. And I have a relationship with the president. I met him back in the 1990s in my many visits. So President Buhari, before he was president and after he was president, we've maintained a discussion process, which has included the work on Transaqua. So then recently, last fall, I was invited to Cote d'Ivoire, my first visit there, very interesting country in West Africa, to observe the election they were having and to gain an understanding of the economy, which is very interesting. So now that brings us to my trip next week to Nigeria and then Ethiopia. And hopefully it will turn out some good results. And I think I'll probably end up getting a pretty strong suntan with the temperatures over there and the hot sun, but that's all part of working in Africa.
Thank you.
Thank
Cynthia,
you.
do you have a follow-up?
Yes. Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari recently called for the relaunching of the Lake Chad Water Transfer Project, otherwise known as the Transaqua, on March 27th during a meeting with the Chad President Idris Deby, stating, quote, "It is imperative that there be water transfer to the Lake Chad from Congo Basin so that the people can resume their normal lives," end quote. Could you say something about the strategic importance of this call and describe what is the Lake Chad Transaqua project more generally for those who may not be familiar with it?
This is a really ingenious project that was developed by an Italian Africanist. I guess they call me an American Africanist, an Italian Africanist named Dr. Marcello Vicchi. And as a young man, I guess in his 40s at that time, he said, look, we've got this very arid area in the Sahel, which is getting more and more dry with only one large body of water, Lake Chad, which is shrinking, contracting. And he said, we have this very moist basin around the Congo River, which at that time, the estimates were about 1.9 million cubic meters of water per year were dumped unmolested, unutilized into the Atlantic Ocean. And so he came up with this engineering hypothesis. He said, well, why can't we build a canal 2,400 kilometers from the Southeast Congo, which will fill it with 5% of the water of the tributaries that feed into the Congo. So we'll have a series of small dams, build this canal, which will go into Central African Republic and join the Chari River. And the Chari River releases its water into Lake Chad. And the estimations then, this was 40 years ago, was that we could possibly get 100 billion cubic meters of water out of the Congo River Basin and refurbish Lake Chad back to 25,000 square kilometers, which it was in the 1960s. This was a gigantic mega lake thousands of years ago, but it kind of settled down at 25,000 square kilometers around the 60s. And the calculations where this could be done. Now, the ingenious part was not only could we save Lake Chad and bring water to the Lake Chad Basin where people are literally living in the worst possible conditions because they were fishermen and farmers and cattlemen, and the lake is dried up on them. The lake was a massive, diverse source of nutrition, farming, various forms of occupations. And what Vicky said is not only can we rebuild or refurbish the lake, but we can make a major economic development zone out of the Lake Chad Basin countries, which are dry, that portion of them, Cameroon, Nigeria, northern Niger, Central African Republic, etc. And we can take those countries and link them economically to the countries around the Great Lake Basin, Tanzania, the DRC, the Republic of Congo, Burundi, Uganda. And so therefore you'd have approximately 12 countries linked economically. We could establish massive increase in hydroelectric power. We could set up major fisheries, agricultural centers, manufacturing centers, add millions of acres of irrigated land. So the idea is use the emergency of filling the lake or refilling the lake to actually establish a major economic output for the entire continent, because you'd be talking about, with these 12 countries, maybe about a third of the size of the African continent would be affected. And this would flow over to the plans of have an east-west railroad, a north-south railroad, which would cross over the area that Transaqua was being built. So it was an engineering hypothesis that needed a feasibility study. And the feasibility study would test the hypothesis. Do these dams produce, can we get enough water? Where do we put the dams? Because you have to have certain rock formations. You have to study the water flow. It's a big project. You take about 30 engineers, hydrologists, and others a year and a half to study this proposal for $5 million, which is nothing compared to what the cost of life and treasure has been. Mm-hmm. And we have not been able to make any progress on that for a long, long time. Finally, China Power became interested. Again, this is myself and others working with Sunusi Abdullahi, and that was progress. And then through the work that I did with the Nigerian government and with the president himself, we had more relations building, and he is very much for it. I mean, I can tell you that for a fact. But the Lake Chad Basin Commission switched its leadership from Sunusi to the current executive secretary, and they have not continued to focus on making sure that there was an agreement. Essentially, the Italian government now has 3 million euro, that's over $3 million, available for a feasibility study. And China Power is indicated they will contribute. So a contract has to be organized for this feasibility study, which Bonifica, the firm that Marcello Vicky worked for, would become the logical one to do the feasibility study. But it's been held up. I can speculate on the reasons. I don't know for sure, and I'm hoping that my trip this week, I can move the process further. At least that's my desire. But this is a huge project. It would be the biggest infrastructure project in Africa. In fact, at the conference we had in 2018 in Abuja, we called it a Kwame Nkrumah Pan-Africa project because it involves 12 countries. And really, you'd be transforming more than just those 12 countries. So this is the kind of thing we should have done. If we had done this 40 years ago, when Dr. Vicky by himself was just traveling around Africa trying to get people to adopt this proposal, we would not be having the genocide and wars we're having in Southeast Congo today. Central African Republic, in the original proposal, would be a major point, a dry port along the Bangui River, where the capital is Bangui. And this would transform the Central African Republic because it'd be a major transshipment point between the canal and the Chari River. So the messes and the lives of thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and the lives we've lost, and the money we spent on USAID and military training would have been better spent on this project. And we would have had some adorable change for life in a major portion of the African continent. Now, it should have been done 40 years ago, but there's an African proverb that the best time to plant a tree would be 20 years ago. The next best time is now. So we have to do it. President Buhari will be in power, president, 2 more years. And hopefully he will kickstart the project and move it into the feasibility stage.
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay. Well, there was you've touched on this now because that was a wonderful, comprehensive answer. Now, both presidents made the point that this would not only be a regional project or even just an African continental project, which is already more than what a lot of people had thought about when they thought about this project, but this would have global ramifications that the whole world would benefit. Both presidents have said in their meeting. Since this does run contrary, and I know you've touched upon this in a variety of ways, but could you say a little bit more about how this would change the way we think of global development if this were permitted to actually happen as it should have 40 years ago? How are they right?
Well, if we go back to your introductory remarks about your concern for Africa and mine as a teenager, there is no objective reason for the suffering and dying and hunger in Africa. No objective reason whatsoever. Africa has a lot of water. Not all of it's in the right place, but we can move water, which is what Transaqua would do. Mm-hmm. Africa has the largest amount of uncultivated arable land. And in the Congo itself, which is where the canal would run through, a very small portion, 5-6 million acres out of 75 million are being used. The Congo could feed Africa. This was also the case in Sudan before it was broken up. What do you need? You need infrastructure. You need energy, lots of energy. There's no energy to speak of in Africa. You need roads. You need high-speed rail. These kinds of developments, if the international leadership, let's say the Western countries, OECD countries, plus China, Russia, India, we join together and we say, we're going to transform Africa. We're going to end poverty, which has now been proven and can be done because the Chinese have done it. We could change the way that everybody normally thinks about political relations. Because instead of geopolitics, which is who's my enemy and who do I have to kill or hurt or keep down so I stay in the top position? The old concept of a zero-sum game, either winning or you're losing. And really, we have to change that to the fact that we can actually win. Everybody can win. The world can actually make progress by nation states working together for a common interest of humanity. In this case, eliminating poverty in Africa. And if you begin to eliminate poverty in Africa through massive investment in infrastructure, then everything changes. Because Africa is going to have 2.5 billion people in approximately 30 years. That's the largest consumer base in the world. They will also have the largest workforce in the world. They will have the largest number of young people in the world. So that the entire global economy could make massive leaps upward by developing Africa. because of its natural condition, plus the resources which are being taken instead of developed there. So if we make a commitment to develop Africa, we change world politics and the way we think about countries and the way we think about people. Because as I've been writing recently, there is no difference between human beings. We have the same universal qualities of creative thinking. And therefore, it's in our interest, it's in every human being's interest to develop every other human being. And in Africa's case, there's a major economic consequence, which is think about if instead of people dying in Africa, people had a high standard of living in Africa, they would be buying advanced capital products from the West. And we can eliminate these scenes that we've all watched of human beings dying for lack of food on the continent which has the most agricultural potential of any continent in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's an extraordinarily important statement. And it also just reminded me of an experience I had in 2010. There was a water emergency crisis conference happening in Montreal, and I had a chance to take part in it. And there was a United Nations Africa expert who was giving a presentation on solving the water crisis he was dealing with the whole continent. And I brought up the issue of Transaqua that I'd only recently begun studying. I was fascinated by it, and I wanted to get his thoughts as an expert on water and Africa. And his response was, that's foolish. It'll never happen because all of the countries that have to come to the table at the same time to discuss this have such disputes and conflict with each other that it would never happen. You have to get some sort of peace treaties that's impossible before you could start even shoveling, like digging your canal. And that really just struck me in listening to you, especially as the cause of the problem, or at least one of the big intellectual causes of the problem of underdevelopment around the world, is that people think, oh, you have to get some sort of a treaty of agreement amongst warring or disputing groups first, and then you can build infrastructure. Whereas what you're getting at is it's the opposite. You start building something that reminds people that they have a common interest. And then after you build things together for a time, you could then start overcoming the historic baggage that different disputing parties have as they're doing something for their kids. So it's just a breath of fresh air to see you invert the problem as you've done.
But there's another factor which is very frustrating and upsetting, which is the fact that you have some in the West who don't believe that the African population really would appreciate technology and improving the lifestyle. I've had this argument in the Lake Chad Basin because you have about 30 million Africans living in the basin around the lake in utter poverty. Then you have another 50, 60,000 that actually live on the lake in little mounds of dirt. I've traveled. I'm probably one of the few Americans ever traveled on Lake Chad, and we saw what it was like. I mean, it was like going back 100 years or 200 years. And so when I was speaking at a conference at the United Nations in 2019, I was invited up by the Nigerian government to speak there at the UN. There were people saying, well, why do you think they want this technology? Why do you think they want this kind of improvement? So it's a very condescending, chauvinistic attitude. And I spoke up. I said, well, they're human beings. And all human beings aspire for development and aspire for development of their intellectual life and qualities, but they require a material standard of living. And I said to the speaker, you got up this morning and you shaved with hot water, you took a shower or bath with hot water, you drove here or took a train to the conference. Why don't you think they want that? So this idea that somehow there's this pristine Africans who want to have a life expectancy of 40 or 50 years, as opposed to 80 or 90 years. It's a very perverted, chauvinistic, racist view. And now, of course, this overlaps with the view that there's too many people. I mean, if you look at one key measurement of any country, of any economy, of any society, you look at longevity of life expectancy. And the Chinese, they almost doubled their life expectancy in about 40, 50 years. Africa has gone up, but it's the lowest in the world. You're talking about, in some cases, 50s, in the 50s. So I'm going to be 70 next month. I wouldn't make it in those countries. And we have to break through these barriers, that human life is sacred and has to be developed, and that there's a universal quality, not a Western or Eastern or African quality. Most Africans themselves want development, but we take Transaqua, for example, no support from the West, except for one country, Italy. And I give credit to the fact they figured it out, that if they want to stop migration from overtaking their country, develop North Africa. So they have been the only supporters in the West. In fact, when I been involved in this for so long, that I've sort of become one of the most knowledgeable people. There's a Nigerian doctor who in the Washington area who's worked a very long time on Lake Chad. But there was a private discussion from the National Defense University, which is a think tank of the Defense Department. It was about 6, 7, 8 people. And they invited me because I'm pretty much the expert on the subject. And that's it for the United States. There is no other U.S., this one seminar, a private seminar I went to, there's no other U.S. interest in this project, and it's only the Italians. And that itself shows you how much our thinking has shrunk over the last 50 years, 60 years since the death of John Kennedy. And when that's very sad, but we've got to try to find a way to break through in any case.
China has increasingly become a leader in African investment, with the BRI framework winning over 37 sub-Saharan states having joined already. What do you think of China's approach to investments and large-scale projects compared to the practices we've seen coming from Western institutions over the past 6 to 7 decades?
The United States, as a matter of policy, not just consensus, but policy, is not to build infrastructure in Africa. I mean, we do have something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation set up by George W. Bush, which does give a few $100 million here and there for a sanitation plant or a water purification plant. But the investment in Africa is going to be tens of trillions of dollars. I once did an estimate that Africa needs 1,600 gigawatts of power. How many tens of thousands of kilometers of rail lines do we need? The US and the West won't do it. Now that could change, but right now, Democrat or Republican makes no difference. They won't do it. China, for very clear historical reasons, made a decision beginning around 2000 to launch into this infrastructure development program. A large part of it is in Africa. Some preceded the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. A lot has developed since then. And they are filling a void, which, by the way, is not enough. There's not enough being built. But if we took China away, no one would fill that void. And the conditions in Africa, as bad as they are, would be worse. That China is playing an invaluable, necessary, important, vital role. Now, there's a lot of detractors who, because of strictly geopolitical reasons, attack China for in Africa. They've made up this nonsense about a debt trap, that China is building these big projects to force these countries into debt, which they won't be able to pay off, and China will seize the asset or control the country, which is actually what the West did beginning in the 1980s with our loans. However, if you use what's available information, the CARI, which is a China-Africa Research Initiative of John Hopkins SICE program, they have produced very accurate information. Out of 1,077 projects in Africa at about a cost of $157 billion, not one project has been seized. Not one country has been taken control of. It's all propaganda, vicious propaganda. The same is true when they talk about that the Chinese bring their own workers into Africa. Again, this is an American study that was done by McKinsey. I think they're based in Canada, consulting. And their average was 89% of the people employed in Chinese corporations, which are mainly small companies, not the large ones, 89% are indigenous labor, that is Africans. So these charges, which unfortunately not only do Westerners believe, but some Africans believe, are designed as a geopolitical attack on China. But very intelligent African leaders have made it clear that they would love the West to be involved, but they're not. And if China were to leave, they have no assurances that anything would replace it. And if anything, the Chinese should be doing more of it, because the needs of Africa on infrastructure are enormous. And it's a matter of life and death that this infrastructure be developed. My hope would be that China and the United States could work together, because you'd have the two greatest economic powers. And my hope was that it could be done in Transaqua. And there's a few people who agree with me in the United States. This would be a perfect project to say, okay, let the two economic superpowers join together and do something revolutionary for Africa, and fund this feasibility project, and then begin the effort of building it, which will take a number of years.
I think as a follow-up to that, if China is not creating a debt trap, it's very confusing, I think, for Westerners to wonder, well, then what is China getting out of investing into African infrastructure projects? Now, we've already been touching on this, but if you could maybe elaborate on the philosophy of China, which is a win-win philosophy, which is not something new, but actually, is a very Confucian concept, and it goes back to centuries of how China has been interacting with foreign countries. And also, if you could say something about, like, I myself think it's a very beautiful concept to think of Africa as the next Renaissance center of the world, and that it's full of potential because it has so much ahead of it in terms of future development. It actually creates a situation where it can develop so rapidly that it could quickly surpass Western nations, which are trying to kind of deal with a collapsing economic state with things that are already pre-existing. Africa can kind of do a lot of leapfrogs in this process, which I think is another thing people don't understand, and that it's a good thing to want to have new players on the field that are contributing to formulating more ideas towards problem solving on a large scale issues, so that this idea of competition is actually completely turned upside down with this concept, and actually it's quite different, that if you allow others to develop, it could enrich your own people.
Well, China has completely different history in its relationship to Africa. I mean, when the Portuguese were looking for gold and traveled around the west coast of Africa down past the Sahara Desert, which began their slave trade in 1440s or 50s, the Chinese, through Admiral He, was already made several voyages up into the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea and that portion of the Pacific, and had landed on the east coast of Africa, Somalia, Kenya, around 1417. So the Chinese had their own orientation towards the eastern portion of the southeastern portion of Africa, which was not based on slavery. I think they brought a giraffe back for the emperor. And then in the 50s and 60s, their orientation was different because China was a developing country, an underdeveloped country. So you had the Bandung Conference in 1955. Zhou Enlai, the prime minister, a very intelligent leader, makes several trips in the 50s and 60s. And so their whole orientation towards Africa is completely different from a political, cultural, economic standpoint. And they, as they built up their economy, which began in the 1980s after the failures of the Cultural Revolution, Africa was a natural place. They built actually the first train in Tanzania to Zambia, I think 1975, when no one else would. So it's now there's a whole historical, epistemological, philosophical view of the Chinese have, which we touched on, with their own view of mankind from Confucius. But in the practical sense, they know that development can take place. They know how to do it. I mean, they took a poor, backward, undeveloped country. I think the lifespan was 39 or 40 years old, maybe 49. And they have eliminated poverty, even by Western accounts. They've eliminated poverty. Somewhere 750 to 800 million people have been taken out of real serious poverty. And how did they do it? Well, they know how they did it. Through science and technology, through massive rail transportation, which is the key to development. I mean, that's been known. The United States knew that from the work of Abraham Lincoln and Friedrich List and others. So they know how that scientifically you can apply certain principles and you can raise up the population of a people. And now that they know they've done it, they know it can be done in Africa. Africa has about, last count, I'm ballparking about 450 million people that they would qualify as living in poverty. That number is growing. The percentage of the population, it's declining because the population grows very fast. But the number of people living in poverty is the largest group of people in the world is in Africa. And in fact, in these projections of 20 years ahead, they project that 9 out of 10 people on the planet who live in poverty will be living on the African continent if we don't change the policy. There are more people in poverty than India has. And of course, they will be, as a continent, have approximately 25% of the world's population. Nigeria will be over 400 million people, will be the third largest country in the world, behind India and China. China will be number 2. So the reality is that this is, if we look at space as the next frontier, which is correct for science development, then we should look at Africa as the frontier here on the planet, which could be the center of a massive development for the whole planet. Because if you're talking about 2.5 billion people out of 9.6, they will have the biggest factor, whether if it's for good or for bad, they will be the biggest factor in human civilization. So it's a natural place. Now you could look at it from geopolitical terms, that the United States and China will now be in competition for Africa because it is the next frontier. Or we could look at it from a more thoughtful standpoint, that the United States and China could collaborate on developing. And if you look at the fact that they're expected to have 1 billion young people in this projection over the next decade or two, that means this is a huge amount of minds that can be developed. We've seen some progress in certain areas of Africa where science and technology has become a very important part of their education, but it's very, very limited. And overall education is very limited. My view is it's going to take at least 1, probably 2, I think is more realistic, generations to move somewhere between 20 and 40 years to move our Africa out of the current dynamic of poverty and hunger. If we do that now, then with that done, then the prospects of a continent producing the kinds of human beings with the material standard of living so they can have the intellectual freedom for discovery, that changes everything. Now, that probably won't happen in my lifetime, but it has to start now. And I think either you look at it from that potential, or you then are going to say, well, we're going to just spend billions and hundreds of billions of dollars on military training and aid and never change or develop this continent, which is what the majority of Westerners think. And most people don't have a vision because really it's not their fault. We don't have a leadership in the West. We don't have any visionary leaders in the West. No one who will stand up like Kennedy did or Roosevelt did and give us an idea of what our potential is. So it's a problem for the West as much as it's a problem for Africa right now. But if we make a breakthrough here, then everything in the world changes for everybody, for the better.
Well said. Thank you.
Yeah, and that sort of sets up my thought for the next question. Because we're currently entering, I think, in a few days, we're going to have the anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's space flight, the first time a human being actually managed to go into orbit. That completely transformed the paradigm of the Cold War for many, many people. And we know that things like NASA got a huge boost. You had John F. Kennedy as the United States leader, who you just touched upon, who was able to use that new trajectory and momentum as a way to change people's perspective of what the future is and what the priorities for science and technology and development for the United States should be. Many people, and I mean, this in large, when you read some of JFK's speeches, not only was he calling for things like breaking the Cold War by working with Russia together on a joint space program, but he was also getting across that human beings should be thinking about not only going to the moon, but thinking far after we die and looking at things like extending human influence to the outer limits of the solar system and beyond. And he was putting backing to it. So you've now said that the U.S. and China should work together. I agree with you. I think we all do, and that's the point of the Rising Tide Foundation, is to promote that view. But many people would say that that's impossible because, and I've encountered this. I'm sure you've encountered this. Cynthia's encountered this. That there's this view that China is intrinsically a different paradigm. They do win-win cooperation. The West does empire, zero-sum geopolitics and imposing your will onto the weaker. That's just the way these two paradigms are, and they're not compatible. And many of these people who say this are also of the view that the USA always had its view to being an empire, going back to the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference that sort of created the World Bank, the IMF, and the post-World War II architecture. Now, that overlooks something I know you've written enormously about, you've lectured about, regarding the anti-imperial historic constitutional traditions of the USA embodied in people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, his vice president, as well as people who were inspired by that vision for what the post-colonial world should be in Roosevelt's mind, like people like John F. Kennedy, who I know, again, you've written about and you've spoken to our group recently about as well. So I was hoping you could maybe say something for the viewers to clarify these two Americas and what was it that subverted this better constitutional America from blossoming as it was going to, in terms of what led the world into the train wreck that we've seen over the past 50, 60 years.
First thing we have to realize is that the United States is not an empire and has never been an empire. In fact, when Africa was carved up at the Berlin Conference from 1984 to 1985.
1884.
I'm sorry, 1884 to 1885, there was no possessions that the U.S. had, although there was one nasty American who was involved in it. But the United States is not an empire, never has been an empire. The United States Constitution and our founding fathers were a gift from heaven for their brilliance in setting up our country. The problem is that we have another side to the United States, which you sometimes call the financial oligarchical side, which is that these people do believe in empire, and they do believe in suppression and destabilization and breaking up countries and weakening countries for the sake of their own political power, even more than their economic power. I mean, for example, if you look at the situation in Africa, China, the latest figures, which the Carey Institute has, which they got from the World Bank, is that China has 13% of the total outstanding debt of Africa is owed to China. Now, that's a lot for one country, but it's not a lot. The multilateral financial institutions have over 30%, maybe 32%. Private bondholders have in the 20%. So China is not the largest debtor. The difference is that China has put its loans, debt, into actually building the country, which we used to think about and used to do. I talked to one former ambassador, person involved in the African policy in the United States, elder statesman, and he said, look, at beginning 1970, we just didn't think about building infrastructure anymore in Africa. And John F. Kennedy was the last one to thoroughly involve himself in building the Volta Dam smelting project in Ghana. So the problem is the United States history is not that of an empire. The problem is we have a class of people who believe in empire. And they also is a part of the Western Europe has a similar section of its leadership involved with this political economic leadership. But this is not the United States. And the problem is that one is lack of leadership. Really, since the death of Kennedy, if you look at every president we've had, some of them had some better qualities, but none of them have been real leaders. And then that compounds the fact that the United States population has been dumbed down seriously, culturally. I mean, if you look at the media, I don't watch the news, I don't watch TV, but I read on the internet. And I mean, the people who are so-called in the news and are sports figures or Hollywood figures, which have no relevance to me as far as the United States or any aspect of culture. So the culture of the United States has been seriously dumbed down. So people have trouble thinking, just thinking. Look, every human being is universally connected by the fact that we all can think creatively, not deductively, not inductively, not logically, but in the sense of discovery of new conceptions and ideas, what Plato called hypotheses. That's what unites all as human beings. And we all have the same desire to develop that quality, whether we know it or don't know it. That's natural human development. And the natural law of the universe is for human beings to intervene on the universe to make it more propitious for human development. That unites us all, so that each nation is basically bringing down from this universal natural law laws for its country based on its culture and its language, its history, its geography. The United States is a wonderful example of a beautiful country geographically, and every country is different. But what unites each country is exactly the same. The betterment of development of civilization and of the people of each country is embedded in the process of development of all countries and all people. So everyone grows. It's similar to the theories that Leibniz and Kruse and others have discussed. Therefore, we have to realize that we Americans are actually better than we're behaving right now. And we don't have a history of empire, and we shouldn't give into that. And the Chinese have a completely different view of their culture, but yet they have a similar view of the development of man, as does Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. As long as we all can agree that human beings are sacred and that human beings are the most precious creature crawling on the earth, then we all can share in a common development program. And the Belt and Road, it was very unfortunate that Xi Jinping made 3 offers to President Obama to join the Belt and Road. Didn't mean we have to submit ourselves to China. We're just going to join the Belt and Road, which 140 countries have, including many European countries. And yet the great liberal Obama just refused it 3 times. So that's a mistake in our leadership. And of course, I don't really see anyone in either of the 2 parties today that inspires me to believe that there is some leadership. There probably is out there. I just don't see it. But it's up to us to fight for a better policy. And if people are concerned about the conditions of life in Africa, then this is the time for us to put forth policies that will change that, not just commiserate. And if China and the United States will collaborate together, the potential is really enormous. I would say unlimited in terms of the change we can make in the lives of 2.5 billion people.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think that's extremely important. And the fact that here we are in Canada as Canadians, you know, our nation as well has played, the great liberal Canada, peacemaker of the world, has also played a major part at disrupting China, at blocking Chinese state enterprises from having any vested interest in mining or construction in Canada, saying that they're all into espionage and subverting the Western neoliberal order. We've condemned the Chinese government for genocide over crimes that are similar to what the ICC was claiming Sudan was doing back in 2009, which you helped to refute over Xinjiang. And no, it's really a self-contradiction, when in reality, it's obviously the case that we have an absolute need to work with the BRI projects, which would benefit everybody who participates enormously in a win-win philosophy. So it's the fact that the US could feasibly do this is also very, very important. So thank you. But something you said, I just wanted to touch upon quickly as a follow-up, because a lot of people, and I really appreciate you laying this out, they have a very difficult time thinking of America as not an empire. Because you say America has never been an empire. Now, its behavior has been imperial at different times in history, but this idea that there are these two identities at war with each other, one is based on the indigenous, natural, constitutional traditions of what made America, that are still, you see every great president who's usually worth something, and usually you know that who they are by virtue of the fact that they tend not to finish or survive through their presidential terms. But you have them always invoking something within the US which is not imperial. And then you have this other thing inside of the USA that never fully left after 1776, which is allied to a very different worldview and different political system and paradigm than anything constitutional from the US itself. So I appreciate you just sort of differentiating and bringing that to the forefront, because without that, there's really not a lot of hope when you hear people talk about, maybe the US can be saved or work with China, or maybe Canada can be saved. If you don't have that differentiation, it's impossible. Those words don't mean anything. So I appreciate that you took the time.
I was just going to follow up on one question that Cynthia asked me, which I didn't answer, which is people have asked what's in it for China when they develop these projects. And I just recently finished a class, a 6-week class entitled "Is China the New Colonizer of Africa?" And that was exactly what people bring up again and again. Well, what's interest for them? Well, there's two things to consider. One is, do we ask the same question every time the United States builds something or gives money away? We're the largest USAID contributor in the world. What do we get out of it? But the other question is, you can't attack the Chinese for being smarter in terms of economy. I think Xi characterizes China now as socialism with Chinese characteristics. But some of those characteristics are completely coherent with what we call industrial, or used to call industrial capitalism. Think about it. If you have a market of people, which is now at least 1.5 billion in my estimate, and that market of people is being developed, their standard of living is going up. That means that not only are they going to be buying more consumer products, but the industries of those countries, which are tiny now, as they grow into great industrial manufacturing centers, they're going to be buying more capital products. So those countries that are in the forefront of capital machine design are going to be selling those products to this continent, which is going to have 25% of the world's population. Are the Chinese smarter capitalists than we are? No, but the problem is we've been corrupted by a concept of finance capitalism or finance imperialism. So we don't see that actually physical products can actually yield a profit that benefit the seller and the buyer. And in terms of, you have people who stay in a little room all day buying and selling stock and trying to make money. I know one of them, a very nice guy, an African. And that's all he does. He looks at stocks and he tries to make enough money to have enough wealth to feed his family and expand his operation. But the fact of the matter is, we can't criticize the Chinese because they believe that you can make money by developing an economy, which is what they're doing. So if you look at the future, what is their interest? Well, I think they also have an interest of developing another underdeveloped continent, as they did themselves. They would like to do for Africa and other continents. But they also are not idiots, and they figure out this is a good way to expand their own economy and have their economy in the forefront of the next layer, next plateau of breakthroughs in machine tool design, which is where they should go and where we should go. And so that we're constantly feeding that into another economy that needs those kinds of products to fully develop itself. So we can't attack them for being capitalists.
No, thank you so much, Larry. I really appreciate, we both really appreciate you having taken the time to go through this this assessment with us. And again, anybody who actually looks at their own political economic history from honest eyes and reads things like Alexander Hamilton, which you've made a point in your website, offers the master key to many of the unsolvable problems of geopolitics and underdevelopment facing the world today, is the reactivation of simple Hamiltonian economic principles. They wouldn't see a dichotomy between personal morality, the well-being of the whole nation, as well as the individual benefit of the parts and profit. There's no dichotomy. And you've made a very clear point in your lectures to us, which we'll make available in the description to this box below, as well as your website. And with that, I'd like you to maybe say to the audience how they could get in touch with you, get your newsletter, go to your website, learn more, support your work.
Well, as I say, about July of 2017, I created my own website, Lawrence Freeman, AfricaInTheWorld.com. And I'd written articles before then, but now I wanted to be able to get them out myself. So that was, I guess, about coming up on 4 years. So it's slow going in the beginning, but it's increased, and it kind of goes in nonlinear jumps. The best thing people can do is on the right-hand side, you can subscribe, and you can just put in your email and you'll get every article when it comes out. People can reach me through there. You send me emails that way. I've had some interesting developments because of my involvement in trying to diffuse and advance the nation of Ethiopia and their economy, and they're of course under attack with a very serious problem around the Tigray region. Some of my articles have gone viral inside Ethiopia. So I've had some huge jumps sometimes in one day, 1 week. I've gotten as many views as I've gotten in 3 years. So you never, ideas are invaluable. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to interject the best ideas we can in these troubled times. I mean, I think the United States, found the United States is one of the greatest things that's ever happened in the world. And I love the United States. But the problem is we don't have quality leadership. I mean, many of our leading people, many of our citizens probably could not even make it through the Federalist Papers because of the language that the Federalist Papers uses. And we have to find a way to create a leadership in the United States that really is based on the founding principles of our founding fathers. And that, if we can succeed in that, then we can change the world and have a great impact on every continent. So it's a tall order, and you don't know where leadership's going to come from or how it's going to emerge. I mean, my situation at the age of 70 is to try to force a breakthrough in American policy towards Africa. And that's my passion. So nothing would stop me from trying to do it. Hopefully I'll succeed, but I'm not going to stop trying.
Well, I think your example is a shining one that really is a reminder that it's incumbent upon all of us who have still access to any portion of our thinking powers and our conscience to do what we can to be instruments of the good, and hope that and have faith that there is a resonance in a time of crisis to good ideas that are needed to put out the fire. That's pretty widespread. So thank you so much for taking the time, and hopefully we'll do this again.
Thank you. Have a good day. Have a good weekend.
You too. Have a good time in Africa.
Bye. mumusumba wa hema
tikameka
bakwingira mumusumba wa hema tukashana bakwingira mumusumba wa hema tukashana bakwingira mumusumba wa hema
tikashana
bakwingira mumusumba wa hema
tikashana
bakwingira mumusumba wa hema chikayira nangeri kumulu mumusumba wa hema chikayira nangeri kumulu mumusumba wa hema
tikalila
chikalila
nawa